Also the president of the Ruskin Art Club. Yay, very happy to be here. Cool program for you tonight. I must mention we have a couple VIPs in the audience, our former provost Chip Zukowski and Professor Kate Flint are in the audience, and we're very happy that you're here. This is our 23rd annual Ruskin Lecture, and I've been a part of the organization for about 7 or 8 years since the archives of the organization came here. With the USC Libraries Special Collections owns the archives for the Ruskin Art Club. It was founded in 1888. It is, by 1 week, the second oldest social club in Southern California. I know, a week, come on. But we're still going. The other one still is, but maybe we can sabotage that one, and we can finally claim the crown. All right, so my job here is just to get everybody's attention. Our speaker for tonight hails from all the way from the UK. She's going to be properly introduced by my Ruskin board colleague, Elena Byrne, who is a widely renowned and accomplished poet, and just as important, a vigorous champion of poets, something the world desperately needs these days as poets open our eyes to new truths. So, Elena, would you please come up and do the honors?
Hello, lovely, intimate group. It's great to have you here. And I hope that we will see you in other events. Maybe become a member, which would be delightful. Then we can have even more intimate interactions. I am the Literary Programs Director for the Ruskin Art Club. One of our goals is to share the fact that about Ruskin's not just that he was a polymath, but, he supported social justice for the working class. He was I would say, an expert in art and architecture. He's one of the first environmentalists. And there's so much in his writings that you'll find really is part of what's going on today. But I'm very delighted to introduce Professor Dinah Birch, who, if you don't already know, she is Commander of the Order of the British Empire, a CBE, from the Duke of Cambridge, and it's a special ceremony at Buckingham Palace, and that was in 2016. Wow. Then you could say, well, that's all you need to know, but there's more. The reason for this is for her service in higher education, literary scholarship, and cultural life. She chaired the REF 214 sub-panel for English literature and language, and the REF 2021 was chair of the main panel in arts and humanities. When Diana first arrived at the University of Liverpool as a professor of English in 2003, she had previously held a fellowship in English at Trinity College, Oxford, and her roles at the university have also included serving as the head of the Department of English, Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and Impact, and Pro-Vice Chancellor for Cultural Engagement. She's been leading the university's annual literary festival and has done so much for the community, including a regular broadcaster and contributor for the Times Literary Supplement and London Review of Books. Professor Birch has served as a member of the Man Booker Prize panel and has published widely on Victorian fiction and poetry and on the work of the critic, of course, John Ruskin, which is why we're here. And generations of students and colleagues have many reasons to be grateful for her unfailing collegiality and generosity, including all of us here at the Ruskin Art Club and USC. She also has a tremendous sense of humor. Please give a warm welcome to Dinah Birch.
Thank you, Elena, for that very generous introduction. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here this evening. And in talking about John Ruskin and gender, I'm tackling a subject that has generated much controversy, and it has been central to readers' responses to his labyrinthine work. In the late 20th century, he was seen to be largely dismissive of women's aspirations, eager to confine them to the domestic sphere, and oblivious to more progressive currents of thought in late 19th century Britain. The American critic Kate Millett, a radical feminist and activist, was a powerful voice here. Her forceful condemnation of Ruskin as a dominant voice within the 19th century oppression of women in her 1970 book, Sexual Politics, proved to be hard to forget, and it was lastingly influential. But Ruskin's gendered identity was complex, and he was far from being a straightforward representative of the Victorian patriarchy. Recent critics like Sharon Weltman, Deborah Nord, Frances O'Gorman have argued for a more balanced analysis of Ruskin's cultural position, placing his life and work in terms of contested models of gender. I want to examine these debates through the lens of Ruskin's approach to ideas of work, the work women and men must do for themselves, for each other, for the world. Ruskin's understanding of what it means to be a worker is central to his cultural criticism and to his legacies in his lifetime and beyond, and it is formed by his multifaceted approach to gender. The Ruskin Art Club, generous sponsor of this lecture, together, of course, with USC, is the starting point for my lecture, in that I want briefly to turn to the club's foundation and history as a reflection of the issues I want to explore. So, the Ruskin Art Club, and of course you will be familiar with this story, was established in 1888 by 4 women: Mary Boyce, Fanny Brainerd, Dora Haynes, and Laura Hubble. Here on the screen, you see Mary Boyce, a leading light in those early years. A strong, handsome face, it seems to me. John Ruskin, thank you, that's very kind, thank you, Jim. John Ruskin, who died in 1900, was then still a living cultural presence in Britain and in America. And identifying the new art club with his name was a very clear declaration of ethos and mission. The Ruskin Art Club is the second oldest women's art club in Los Angeles. The Shakespeare Club is older by, I think, 8 days.
7 days.
7 days. Accuracy is always important. And it was formed at a time when the city was still at an early point in its development, facing many problems, but animated by the sense that new and better ways of living might be possible after the national trauma of the Civil War. A shared ambition to know more about art was the primary reason for the club's foundation. Boyce's collection of prints and books on art was to be the starting point of a disciplined study of the technique and history of engraving and etching. This was not to be knowledge acquired simply for its own sake or as a genteel entertainment. The club had, and still has, a wider purpose. What the first prospectus described as, I quote, the earnest study of masterful works of art would enable its members to make art available to a broader public, enriching lives, challenging the competitive materialism that drove the expanding cities of America. So the club didn't simply meet for a couple of hours of enjoyable chatter. Members were offered a very serious program of educational activity centered on an annual course of study in the history of art, architecture, archaeology, running for 8 months of the year. Lectures were delivered by the members. The women members of the club didn't bring in external experts. They did it themselves, alongside a weekly schedule of topics, also researched and presented by the members. All of this sounds, in fact, very like a course of higher education, and it must have involved a significant commitment of time for members who were genuinely engaged. If you look across the room at the display of printed material there, you won't be able to do that if you're on Zoom or listening to the recording, but you will, I think, in that way form a good idea of how serious the program of study was. Detailed, demanding, ambitious. The word masterful is telling in that original description of the club's mission, the earnest study of masterful works of art. Ruskin was the master of the utopian Guild of St. George, first formed in 1871 as St. George's Company to challenge the damaging consequences of urbanization and unregulated industrial capitalism. Here is the Guild's logo, and here is the dragon, slain by a St. George. At the time of the club's foundation, Ruskin was also serving as the inaugural slave professor of fine art at the University of Oxford. In those roles, he represented a conventional masculine authority. Choosing the name of the club at their first meeting, the Ruskin Art Club, the membership was consciously identifying themselves with a male cultural figurehead. But they were also associating themselves with a figure whose characteristic values were more usually linked with femininity. Ruskin was commonly seen to be a figure whose interests in watercolour painting, in the natural world, in the responsible care of the poor, were generally seen to be the business of women rather than men. And men, especially men in positions of power, often responded to him as a feminine, or even sometimes an effeminate figure. They commented on his charm, his sensitivity, his sympathy, his delicacy, characteristics more usually praised in a woman than in a man. The formidable Charles Eliot Norton, Harvard professor and Ruskin's closest friend in America, described him as boyish. And the public failure of his marriage tended to confirm that image. Ruskin was not altogether a man's man. This quasi-feminine identity coexisted with his influential position as a major critic. It's one of the reasons for his ambivalently gendered appeal to culturally ambitious women. In naming their club after Ruskin, Boyce and her colleagues were following the example of many similarly high-minded women of their generation. A large proportion of Ruskin's British admirers and followers were women. They read Fors Clavigera, the polemical monthly newsletter that Ruskin developed as a kind of very personal house journal for the Guild of St. George in the 1870s and 1880s. They joined the proliferating Ruskin societies in Britain's expanding industrial cities. They signed up as companions of the Guild of St. George, which, like membership of the Ruskin Art Club, was not a trivial undertaking. In 1876, 5 years after the Guild's beginnings, 20 of its 30 really active members were women. Artists like Kate Greenaway or Anna Blunden, social reformers like Octavia Hill, craftswomen like Marianne Twelves, influential educationalists like Margaret Bell, they would all turn to Ruskin for guidance and practical support, which was forthcoming. Ruskin was generous with his time, generous with his support. Edith Hope Scott, and here she is in her later years. Edith Hope Scott ran a school with her sisters in Liverpool in the late 19th and earlier 20th century, and she was characteristic of this cohort of female supporters. She wrote of her devotion to Ruskin in her autobiography, published in the 1930s. I quote, "My connection with Ruskin Society and Ruskin's Guild of St. George was a whole-time job. There were meetings, group meetings and monthly meetings, the Mulberry Cottage Circle, the spinning industry, and the tremendous fever and excitement of the movements of the Guild of St. George. All the period of my life from 1883, when I joined the Guild, till Ruskin's death in 1900, seemed to have had the thread of Ruskin's influence running through it." So the Guild's activities were focused on the promotion of the understanding and appreciation of art, the encouragement of arts and crafts rather than mass production, and the revival of what we would now call sustainable agriculture and horticulture. Sustainable, not a word that Ruskin would have used, but that was the concept. Of course, the Guild did not become the means of transforming a nature's way of life, and Ruskin and its members never really thought that it would. Its emblematic projects were always on a small scale, local, not national. Mark Frost's important 2014 book on the early history of the Guild, The Lost Companions, shows that those who committed themselves wholly to its work, as some members did, were often not well supported. But its ideals made a difference to many lives. And like the Ruskin Art Club, the Guild of St. George is still in existence, still active, pursuing the broadly defined objectives that Ruskin laid out for it in its original code, which was to be accepted by all new members. And now, in fact, the Ruskin Art Club and the Guild of St. George have many connections and associations. So, central to the Guild's code was the responsibility to work. I quote, "I will labour with such strength and opportunity as God gives me for my own daily bread, and all that my hands find to do, I will do with my might." So that form of words is a reminder that the deepest roots of Ruskin's social ideals lay in his early identity as an evangelical Christian steeped in biblical study. He renounced that evangelical Christian faith in middle age, but he did not abandon its values. The companion's promise to labour refers to the book of Ecclesiastes. "Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might. For there is no work, nor device, nor knowledge, nor wisdom in the grave, whither thou goest." But the labour required of the Guild's companions was not simply a matter of securing their daily bread. They would work for others in a community based on cultivating the land and developing the traditional crafts that Ruskin saw as essential to life as it should rightly be lived. I quote, "We will try to take some small piece of English ground, beautiful, peaceful, fruitful. We will have no steam engines upon it and no railroad. We will have no untended or unthought of creatures on it, none wretched but the sick, none idle but the dead. The life of Edith Hope Scott is a demonstration of what this might mean in practice. Edith was born in 1861 as the daughter of an adventurous Scottish sea captain who settled in Liverpool. She joined the Guild in 1883 when she was 22 years old, and in the same year she helped to found the Ruskin Society in Liverpool. Her participation in the Mulberry Cottage enterprise mentioned in that autobiography was a product of her devotion to Ruskin's principles. She describes in her autobiography a small circle of earnest and idealistic young people, fellow members of the Guild, who joined forces to rent Mulberry Cottage in Wavertree, a suburb of Liverpool. And there's that word earnest again, and they were earnest. The group held discussion groups on a wide variety of topics on Saturday afternoons, not wholly unlike the Ruskin Art Club, though I think less formal as a programme of study, over tea and toast, debating politics, sharing views on the books they were reading. In the walled garden behind the cottage, they grew flax, wheat, fruit, flowers. They also kept poultry, bees and pigs. Though it has to be said, the pig keeping did not go at all well. Remembering Mulberry Cottage in that autobiography, Scott was nostalgically rueful. Looking at the cottage episode from this side of the war, it is half comic, half pathetic to see how seriously we took the idea of doing our share of the work of the world. But we learned a lot of things at Mulberry Cottage, and it revolutionised our personal lives for some of us, and I think few who went there have not the marks of it left in their lives. Here's a picture, not very clear, of the companions of the Guild in the grounds of Mulberry Cottage. And I think one thing it does show is how the young men and young women stood side by side, more or less equal in number. They were companions together to try this experiment in living that the cottage represented for them. And that Mulberry Cottage experience certainly changed Scott's life. She learned how to spin and weave by hand, and she taught others to do so. She went on to establish a small cottage industry producing linen, the spinning industry that she refers to in her autobiography. When the cottage enterprise came to an end in 1901, she and a few other women members of the Ruskin Society initiated a class to teach blind girls how to spin and to sell the linen that they produced to become self-sufficient. It was a project that only came to an end, like so much work of this kind, with the outbreak of the First World War. And it was at that time she relinquished the girls' school that she'd been running with her sister, although she continued to publish fiction and poetry, yet another of her multiple activities. She was a woman of very considerable energy, Edith Hope Scott. So many of Scott's multiple endeavours were focused on the responsibility to learn and to teach, and this is characteristic of the work undertaken by idealistic and socially progressive women of her generation. A focus on education is something that the Ruskin Art Club had in common with the undertakings of the Guild of St. George. Ruskin was an educator, and he was a committed supporter of serious education for women provided by women. The schools that were to be part of the Guild's programme were to furnish the same courses of study for boys and girls, though with different purposes. He insisted on opening his Oxford lectures to women, the bonnets, as he put it, and they attended in large and enthusiastic numbers. He supported the foundation of the first women's colleges in Oxford with money and with gifts, not just with warm words. Somerville, Lady Margaret Hall in Oxford, and then Girton in Cambridge, and Whitelands in London. He also supported Winnington Hall, a progressive girls' school in Cheshire, and Cheltenham Ladies' College. He argued that those who taught girls should have the same level of respect and of income as those who taught boys, and that girls should be given access to vigorous physical education, uncensored reading, courses in science, opportunities to venture outdoors and learn about the natural world at first hand. Here is Winnington Hall. And here are the girls playing croquet in crinolines, and it must have been very tiresome. All of this seems uncontroversial now, but at the time, Ruskin's ideas were challenging and even radical. I quote, "Let a girl's education be as serious as a boy's. Give them the same advantages that you give their brothers." Not so many people were saying that in the 1860s and 70s. That's a quotation from Of Queen's Gardens, a lecture included in Sesame and Lilies, a volume published by Ruskin in 1865. Sesame and Lilies was the book that was, for many women, their first and perhaps only introduction to his writing. For many years, it was his most popular book in both Britain and America. It was widely taught in American high schools in the early decades of the 20th century, in fact, right through the 1930s. Sesame and Lilies was a central plank of the curriculum. Members of the Ruskin Art Club in the early phases of its history were very likely to have encountered Of Queen's Gardens. And that lecture was the primary target for Kate Millett's attack on Ruskin. And it's not hard to see why. The tone of Ruskin's writing in that lecture can seem to the ears of a modern woman patronising, hectoring, or febrile. And, as Millett pointed out, his insistence that women must bear primary responsibility for the moral welfare of humanity is hard to accept. I quote, "There is not a war in the world, no, nor an injustice, but you women are answerable for it, not in that you have provoked, but in that you have not hindered. Men, by their nature, are prone to fight. They will fight for any cause, or for none. It is for you to choose their cause for them, and to forbid them when there is no cause. There is no suffering, no injustice, no misery on the earth, but the guilt of it lies with you. Men can bear the sight of it, but you should not be able to bear it. Men may tread it down without sympathy in their own struggle, but men are feeble in sympathy and contracted in hope. It is you only who can feel the depths of pain and conceive the way of its healing. Instead of trying to do this, you turn away from it. You shut yourselves within your park walls and garden gates, and you are content to know that there is beyond them a whole world in wilderness, a world of secrets which you dare not penetrate, and of suffering which you dare not conceive." You can see why that was trying. But this appeal to women's supposed responsibility does amount to an exhortation to move into the world and to address the suffering beyond the sheltered life of a middle-class woman, to move beyond the park walls and to open the gates. And that is how it was often understood at the time. That's the message that Edith Hope Scott and the women who thought as she did took from Ruskin's exhortation and tried to translate into models of practical service. In short, they went into the world to work. And as so often in Ruskin's fiercest reproaches directed to others, he is also admonishing himself. Like the women he's addressing, he had been guilty, or so he had come to feel, of an indefensibly sheltered life, living with his parents, as he had for many years, reflecting on art, on architecture, on nature, publishing very expensive books, available only to few, refusing to address the suffering beyond his own garden gate. So in the 1860s, he transformed the principles of his writing, moving away from the production of those large books on art, architecture, modern painters, stones of Venice, and focusing instead on shorter, more accessible essays and lectures, and on the programs of reforming initiative that were to culminate in the foundation of the Guild and the publication of Fors Clavigera in the 1870s. His life had never been leisurely, but in the 1860s it became frantically busy as he contended with his increasing dismay and depression in the face of the ruthless social and economic abuses that he saw around him. Work was a duty, but it could also serve as a form of therapy, a means of dealing with despair. In 1883, he made the point to the readers of Fors Clavigera: "There are no chagrin so venomous as the chagrin of the idle. There are no pangs so sickening as the satieties of pleasure. Nay, the bitterest and most enduring sorrow may be borne through the burden and heat of day bravely to the due time of death by a true worker. And, indeed, it is this very dayspring and fount of peace in the bosoms of the labouring poor which has, till now, rendered their oppression possible. Only the idle among them revolt against their state. The brave workers die passively, young and old, and make no sign. It is for you to pity them, for you to stand with them, for you to cherish and to save." And Ruskin's emphasis on that need for work and its practical value in the world is aligned with a central strand of thinking among the leading feminists of the period, who have more in common with Ruskin's thought than might be supposed. Anna Jameson, an influential thinker in the reforming women's circles of the 1850s, was an advocate of the concept of a communion of labour. In the 1860s, members of these circles, including Barbara Leigh Smith, Bessie Parks, Anna Mary Howitt, began to publish articles and pamphlets on questions of middle-class women's employment. And the critic Linda H. Peterson has drawn attention to the importance of these contributions to public debate in relation to Ruskin's work. The feminist Bessie Rayner Parks, for instance, published on topics including "What can educated women do? A year's experience in women's work, The Market for Educated Women's Labour. Those were influential pamphlets. In 1865, the year in which Sesame and Lilies appeared, Parkes published her definitions of the 6 essential requirements for women's development, and they are not widely different from the principles of Ruskin's Of Queen's Gardens, though Parkes frames them in different terms. Let women be thoroughly developed. Let women be thoroughly rational. Let women be pious and charitable. Let women be properly protected by law. Let women have fair chance of a livelihood. Let women have ample access to all stores of learning. In her pamphlet on women and work, published in 1857, Barbara Leigh-Smith also sounded remarkably Ruskinian. She argues that no human being has a right to be idle. The land we own, we should drain and make more fertile forever. The children who are in our power should be educated. If sickness falls upon our town, we must try to stop its progress and to alleviate the suffering it occasions. If an old roof lets in the rain, we must new slate it, and we must train ourselves to do our work well. And like Ruskin, in this 1857 pamphlet, Leigh-Smith emphasised that work would, alongside its practical benefits, promote the peace and health of those who undertook its responsibilities. She claimed that idleness leads to disease in women, especially, I quote, that one terrible disease, hysteria, in its multiform aspects that incapacitates thousands. Hysteria, I should say, a term that had a slightly different meaning in the 1850s to the one that we're familiar with. Really, she refers to issues of mental health. Now, the views of these women are by no means wholly aligned with those of Ruskin. They are often, though not always, thinking of opportunities for educated women's paid employment. This, for Ruskin, was not entirely the point, though he would always pay generously for any work that he might ask a woman to do for him. But Ruskin shared their firm belief that women had serious work to do in the world, and they shared his belief. Those two currents of thought flowed in a parallel direction. These views didn't mean that Ruskin had any sympathy with the notion that work of any description, work for work's sake, would serve to change lives for the better. The futile and supposedly corrective tasks sometimes required of prisoners, for instance, were not at all what he had in mind. Certain conditions needed to be in place. He commented on what they should be in his 1851 pamphlet on Pre-Raphaelitism. In order, he said, in order that people may be happy in their work, these 3 things are needed. They must be fit for it. They must not do too much of it. And they must have a sense of success in it. The 3 enduring principles, it has always seemed to me. And if their happiness in their work was to be productive, the work must be of the right kind. When 19th century women refer to their work in the context of the household, what they usually mean, in fact, is needlework. For families with limited incomes, making and repairing garments was a practical necessity. Clothes were expensive, they were not easily bought or replaced. Ruskin's identification of the Greek Athena, the Greek goddess, the queen of the air, as he describes her in his 1869 book of that title, as his tutelary spirit, foregrounds that dimension of women's work. Athena was the goddess of wisdom, warfare, and household crafts, and among her emblems was the distaff. For Ruskin, she was the divine embodiment of women's work as fighters, as weavers, as menders, and as makers. This was true in the literal sense, and many of Ruskin's female followers, like Edith Hope Scott, associated themselves with textile crafts of many different kinds. Towards the end of his life, Ruskin named the Langdale linen industry as the most successful of his contributions to what we would now call the arts and crafts movement. It was an enterprise established in the English Lake District by Susanna Beaver and Marion Twelves, later run by Annie Garnett, spinning and weaving handmade linen. And at its height, it provided employment for 2,000 Lakeland women. It was a significant industrial enterprise, a rural enterprise. An example of Ruskin's linen, often decorated as this is. It's a bag, as you see, a drawstring bag. The Ruskin linen shop, alas, no longer in operation. But weaving wasn't just a matter of producing linen or mending shirts in Ruskin's eyes. It was also a metaphor for the imaginative and ethical work of connection that he saw as women's special concern, as it was his own distinctive business. Largely uninterested in decorative embroidery or tapestry, unlike William Morris, Ruskin focuses on the housewifely task of stitching things together, making and mending, creating serviceable sense out of disorder. Athena's mythical loom produces reverent celebration. Her rival, Arachne, in that myth of weaving associated with Athena, Arachne spins pictures of rebellion and anarchy, and she is accordingly transformed into a spider, an arachnid, capable only of creating webs to entrap flies. So here's an image of a woman at work in the Langdale spinning industry, spinning thread from flax. I can't help but feel that they have considerably tidied up the room for the photograph, but still, you can form an impression of what the work involved. And here is John Everett Millais' completely gorgeous picture of Mariana, painted in 1851, a picture now in London's Tate Britain. This painting refers to Tennyson's 1830 poem about the Shakespearean Mariana, who figures in the play Measure for Measure. Mariana languishes in a moated grange, hopelessly waiting for a lover who fails to turn up. I quote, "She only said, 'My life is dreary. He cometh not,' she said. She said, 'I am aweary, aweary. I would that I were dead.'" In Millais' painting, Mariana has been occupied with ornate embroidery rather than household needlework. Her dejection has evidently given her backache, and in this picture, she is no longer working at her unrewarding task. Ruskin admired the picture, and in discussing Millais' work in 1878, he described it as the perfectest of his work and the representative picture of that generation. But his praise is qualified. Mariana is no Annunciate Maria. bowing herself, but only a newsless Mariana stretching herself, which is indeed the best symbol of the mud-moated 19th century in its grange, stable, sty, whatever name of dwelling may best befit the thing it calls houses and cities imprisoned therein by the unassailablest of walls and blackest of ditches. In his 1886 comments on the picture, he is resolute. If the painter had painted Mariana at work in an unmoated grange, instead of idle in a moated one, it had been more to the purpose, whether of art or of life. Ruskin's meaning is clear. Women need to shake off the idleness of their moated lives and undertake the work in the world that was both an obligation and a right. For women, as for men, work was the essential means of creating a better world. Thank you.
So we're going to take some questions.
We have a handheld microphone here if anyone wants to ask a question.
Thank you for that very interesting lecture. My question is about the influence economy, if you will, of these pamphlets you reference. I'm curious about, was there a tiered system between who the women's pamphlets would reach versus men's pamphlets? What was the circulation like? How did they get around, and how did they influence the conversation?
That's a very good question, and the answer is necessarily complex. And so those women's pamphlets that I quoted the titles had quite restricted circulations, but they did generate controversy among those who read them. They were largely read by those who were already committed to engaging with the debate surrounding issues of that kind at the time. They didn't have a very wide reach. And that does contrast with the shorter publications that Ruskin was producing at about the same time, sometimes rather later. Those pamphlets, because he had an established name as the author of Modern Painters, Seven Lamps of Architecture, Stones of Venice, generated very wide interest. And they were affordable. They were within the reach of those who wanted to see what this new phase of Ruskin's thinking was producing. But there again, there's complexity. Those pamphlets, excuse me, often generated a good deal of criticism among the London establishment of cultural critique, the Saturday Review, for instance, other established reviews of that kind. The widest circulation was in the industrial Midlands and North and Northwest, where they were often read by working people, women and men, and often in reading circles. So that one member of the circle would buy a pamphlet and then would read it aloud to those who were interested. That kind of dissemination didn't really happen with the campaigning feminist pamphlets. Of course, the study of readerships is always formidably difficult and complicated because we never do quite know who was reading what and how. But that was the broad pattern at the time. But one thing we do know is that kind of polemical publication was reaching people of a very different demographic from those who had been reading the really very expensive multi-volume productions that Ruskin had previously published. That was a much more affluent, aspirational, middle-class readership. So Ruskin was very consciously shifting his audience, whereas, of course, the feminists of the time, writing those campaigning pamphlets, were aiming really to shift thought among policymakers and opinion makers. So it is complex.
I'm wondering if during the period that Ruskin was writing, he commented on women's suffrage.
Yes, though not in positive ways. And I should add, he wasn't very enthusiastic about men's suffrage either. And the reason for that is that he had no faith in the political institutions of the day to deliver what was needed. He didn't really believe that Parliament and its doings were going to make a difference to the lives of working men and women. In that, I think he was wrong. I think that legislation that did manage and regulate working conditions, for instance, of people in mines and mills did make a difference. Not always quite the difference that they might have made or should have made, but there's no doubt that it did make a difference. But Ruskin's view, and this was a view that extended, as I say, beyond women, it was a general view, is that working people should make their own changes, that they shouldn't wait for a governmental elite to improve and change, transform their lives, that they should do the work that was necessary, but that they would be helped by people who had the resource and the time to do so. But he had very little faith in members of Parliament.
I have two questions, and I'd like to phrase them as briefly as possible so as to put the attention on what you have to say. The first is, would it be fair to say that the disdain of Kate Millett towards Ruskin is born of the disdain that usually that revolutionaries show to progressives? And the second question is it possible that we do not have an appreciation for what Ruskin says because, for the most part, we do not engage in work that involves our hands and skill?
Yeah. Thank you. Those are two very different questions. So I'll start with the first. Where did Kate Millett's hostility come from? She wasn't alone in that hostility. She was a representative voice. And as I've said, I think it is really very understandable. I think you're right that she was a radical reformer and saw Ruskin's comments and exhortations as really beside the point, distractions. But I think too that she was still working within that framework generated in the first instance by high modernism, an earlier generation, that men like Ruskin, with their beards and their voluminous productions and publications, their elaborate language, and their overall kind of high moralistic tone had been overtaken by events. A new culture had swept all that aside. I don't think Kate Millett, and I can understand why this is so, had read at all widely in Ruskin. I don't think she had a fully informed appreciation of the breadth and complexity of Ruskin's activities. But nevertheless, she really did home in on an aspect of Ruskin that, as I said in the lecture, is indeed trying. The way in which Ruskin heaps opprobrium on women who were themselves so constrained in action. But the point really that I wanted to emphasize there is that was not how it was received at the time by women who needed a validating voice. I think your second question is very interesting and very important, because on the one hand, we see Ruskin as a reforming idealist, working through the printed page, of course, through lectures, through the spoken word. But nevertheless, and this is true really throughout his life, he is a curiously practical thinker. He's very interested, primarily interested, in the material world, in things, and in our response to the material world. And this takes us back to his views on the environment and the importance of that connection with things around us, wood, metal, stones, things that we can make. And his central belief, to put it simply, perhaps oversimply, but nevertheless, that what makes people happy is making and creating and making things. Not necessarily highly skilled decorative things. You don't have to be a skilled watercolour artist or a weaver to participate in that joy of creativity. It is something that is open to us all. So many of his most popular works did focus on that kind of process, as, to take one example, The Elements of Drawing, which was a handbook, really, for those who wanted to try to produce competent drawing. Often, of course, that would end in failure, because it's a very difficult thing. But Ruskin's step-by-step guide, okay, so you want to draw, this is how to begin. Step 1, step 2, step 3, and how he takes you through a process of learning how to manage your pencil, your paper, how to look at the object that you want to draw and transfer that into a physical drawing. I think that's very central to what people found appealing in his work, that materiality, the thinginess, if you like, of Ruskin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a question online, if I can go ahead and ask that.
Yes, of course.
And I'm assuming that the person can hear. In light of contemporary comments about Ruskin, I wonder how you think Ruskin saw himself. Did he think of himself as effeminate or even quasi-effeminate?
He isn't consistent on that matter, as indeed in many other matters, I may say. There were times when he did very consciously identify himself with a woman's perspective. One example of that would be his relations with Oxford. He became very disillusioned with the male students in Oxford. He thought that they were not serious and they were not committed, and that they spent far too much of their energy and time on futile pursuits, mostly sport. He could never really see the point of sport. Another kind of central male activities, he thought really were kind of futile waste of time. Club life, which was so important to the middle-class Victorian gentleman, they thought it was a complete waste of time. Why bother? Whereas the young female students in Oxford, who had generally joined the university the hard way and were very high-minded and very idealistic and very clever and very hard-working. I'm sure there are many exceptions to that rule, but broadly speaking, that's what Ruskin encountered. Those were the people that he identified with and thought that the hope for the future lay in. But there are also occasions and moments where he is very much the male authority, the master, the professor, perfectly capable of laying down the law as such in an authoritative way. But I think that behind that, going back to a point that I was making about the roots of his work in evangelical Christianity, there's always something in Ruskin, and I don't mean this in any pejorative sense, that is the preacher. And much of his work takes the form of secular sermons. And the preacher does not speak with his own authority. He speaks with an authority outside his own mind. The preacher will explain as best he can the meaning of a text. And, of course, a Christian preacher, it will be a biblical text. But Ruskin's work as a preacher involve the explication of texts in nature or in art or in architecture. But the authority, that male, that masculine authority with which he does that work, is always, I think, in his mind, not finally his own authority, but that which he is taking from a body of truth which he is interpreting. And I think that makes a difference. So again, and my answers often come back to this, it is a complex business. And Ruskin's mind is a complex one, and it's not always a wholly consistent one. He moves and shifts from place to place, from idea to idea, from position to position. And that, I think, it was actually one of the things that made him appealing. You know, he is a multifaceted thinker.
I think this young woman had a question back here.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. One of the questions that I had was around the guild and to what extent that had sort of a reach geographically and also in terms of the groups of people who were interested in the guild and getting involved in that.
Thank you. It never had a wide reach. It was the land that they did acquire and indeed still hold, in geographical terms, was quite scattered. You know, small pockets of land that people worked with, and the activities were quite diverse, including, for instance, the establishment of a small museum for working men with free entry in Sheffield for the working men of Sheffield. So the activities were quite dispersed, never had a wide reach. What I think had a wider reach was Fors Clavidra, the monthly journal, because of course that was much more available, more easily read, though it's not an easy publication, but certainly more accessible for people. So the list of active companions was never a long one, nor did they ever really make a huge national difference, except in an emblematic sense. But Fors was widely read, and read by all kinds of different people, working men, working women, middle-class women, clergymen, lawyers, teachers, craftspeople. Fors did, I think, have a different kind of audience.
Okay, I think that's it in terms of questions. I know that our Executive Director, Gabriel Meyer, would like to have a few words.
Executive directors always have a few words. Again, our deepest appreciation to Professor Dinah Birch for her insights. I heard in 2019 Dinah give a lecture on Ruskin and women, which I thought the most insightful and balanced, treatment I had ever heard on this complex and very difficult subject. As Tyson mentioned, this is the Ruskin Art Club's 135th year. As of October the 12th, we will be 135 years old. The comment that Tyson was referring to earlier was, I once got a phone call from someone from the Shakespeare Club in Pasadena, and she said, when were you founded? And I said, well, 1888. She says, no, what month? I said, October. She says, what day in October? I said, October 12th. She says, stop calling yourselves the oldest, cease and desist calling yourself the oldest cultural association in the Southland. We were founded October 5th. So we've settled for Los Angeles. So we think that's probably safe. I wanted to mention our next activity. On October the 5th, Thursday, October the 5th, we will have an in-person lecture, which will also be virtual, at the Denenberg Gallery in West Hollywood. Professor Sarah Woods coming to us from the UK, but here in the US on a Fulbright, is giving a talk on the elements of drawing, Ruskin's elements of drawing as a source of life lessons. So will be, I think, a profoundly interesting presentation as she explores the way in which Ruskin's handbook on the drawing techniques, has greater and more significant implications for life. This lecture tonight will be posted on our YouTube channel, www.ruskinartclub.org, our YouTube channel, on our website, as all of our presentations are. So you will find it all there. I think we have more than 80 lectures and presentations on the YouTube channel currently. And it's really, for us, it's really part of our mission. We feel that the lectures such as this tonight not only enrich us, but we want it to be available to continue to fertilize our perspective and our minds, and to be available to larger and larger audiences. And I was amazed that a lecture that one of our people gave that had, I think, 20 people on Zoom, now I think has something like 2,500, hits. So it really is part of this new world that we're in, that I think that COVID sort of initiated us into, but which has proved to be so amazing. Okay, one thing a number of people have asked about reading Ruskin. One thing I would simply indicate that on our website, on our resources tab, we have available the entire works of Ruskin on PDF, the library edition. So this is courtesy of Lancaster University, which we bless them every day for this, because it really it makes it possible for people to read widely in Ruskin. So that's available on our Ruskin Art Club website under resources. On our tables are some pamphlets, printed pamphlets of past Ruskin lectures, and also a monograph of the history of the Ruskin Art Club. On this table over here, for those who came in later, are some samples of treasures from our Ruskin Art Club storehouse, some programs from the early 1900s, I think through 1941, gives you an example of what Dinah was talking about in terms of the ambitious programs that the ladies of the Ruskin Art Club set themselves, and then some other treasures that the two-volume, the vellum edition of Ruskin's poems. Oh, and also, along with the pamphlets, a selection, some books that give programs from other Ruskin organizations at the beginning of the 20th century that were going on at this same period. The Ruskin Society of Birmingham, the Ruskin Reading Guild of London, gives you some idea again of this kind of movement at the time that the Ruskin Art Club was founded, of organizations that were seeking to read together these works and discuss their implications. So again, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Professor Birch. And thank you, SC.
Interesting. The description of the club.